The American M113 armored personnel carrier is perhaps one of the most instantly recognizable military vehicles in the modern world. This is both due to its involvement in some of the most iconic conflicts for purposes of media, at least in the Western world, so for example, its time serving in the Vietnam War, but also the fact that it has been in use for many decades and has been in use by many, many countries during that time. But if people think about what was the American armored personnel carrier that preceded the M113, the closest the average person is going to get, even most military enthusiasts, is going to be those that served with the United States military in World War II, the various half-tracks. So today, I'm going to be covering the between, specifically what came before the box. The history of American armored personnel carriers leading into the M113, which of course means we have to look at what the Americans had during World War II. These were various half-tracks, be they M2, M3, M5, or M9, depending on when it was made and who made it. As a pretty simple vehicle, all things considered, and a pretty good platform, there were many, many specialist variants that would be built off of it. For example, the M3 75mm gun motor carriage was a tank destroyer. The M21 81mm mortar motor carriage, try saying that 3 times fast, it's a bit of a tongue twister, which was a self-propelled mortar, and the M16 machine gun motor carriage, which was a quad 50 cal AA platform. Over 50,000 of the various American half-tracks would be made throughout the war, and they would be used extensively within the US military, but would also be transferred over to various allied nations. For example, the British motor infantry units would use them in conjunction with their tanks, as well as the Soviets would use them, although in a more limited degree simply due to not having enough of them. The M3 Scout Car variant, which was a very related design, would actually see pretty extensive use as part of their specialized reconnaissance units, the Razvedka. But these designs did have some limitations. Pictured here is the AA and the tank destroyer versions mentioned previously. Those limitations were they didn't have any overhead protection, so this was a vulnerability in urban environments, and the armor, though appreciated, was thin enough that it could be penetrated at close range with just regular small arms fire. These two facts meant that the infantry didn't want to fight while in these vehicles in most cases, as the protection would be simply not enough, especially if your enemy showed up with something heavier than a rifle caliber munition, which wasn't as frequently an issue for the Allies. The Germans didn't make particularly large use of things such as a 50 caliber machine gun, which they didn't have one. But if you encountered something like a 20mm flak gun used in a anti-ground role, it would rip through these things without any issue. Another limitation is its half-track nature. While that offers a nice mix of some road ability and some off-road ability, it wasn't as good as either a fully tracked or a fully wheeled platform on, respectively, off-roads or on-roads. So it was a bit of a stuck-in-the-middle situation. This would lead the Americans to wish to create a fully tracked, fully enclosed infantry carrier, and these discussions would start in the later stages of World War II, think 1944, 1945. At first, they looked at what was already in service, and this led them to the M39 armored utility vehicle. These were produced in 1944 and were based off of the M18 Hellcat. About 640 of them would be made. They were primarily used as things like prime movers, artillery tractors, and ammunition carriers. But they could be used as armored personnel carriers in a pinch, and this would actually happen to a limited degree in Korea, although they were open-topped and could only carry about 6 dismounts, so clearly wasn't good enough to simply be moved into that role without much modification other than, maybe giving it a roof. The number of dismounts just wasn't enough. This would lead to the first, more or less, purpose-built attempt, the T-13. This was to be a fully enclosed, fully tracked infantry carrier, and was to be able to carry about 2 squads of infantry. 18 to 22 men is how it's described. in the various sources I can find. This was based off of the M24 light tank chassis, but the T code indicates that it never became a fully production vehicle or entered service, and the only images you can find of it are artists' interpretations or renditions of it, because as far as I'm aware, it never left the drawing board. For what reason, I also can't particularly find. There's very, very limited information you can find about this thing. But having learned, presumably something, from that first attempt, they moved on to a slightly larger option, the M44. This would return to being based off of the M18 platform. It was capable of carrying 24 dismounts, so if you used 8-man sections, you could actually fit an entire platoon in this thing. However, its combat load was 23 tons. The M18 it was based off of was 19. 6 of these would be made for testing and evaluation, and thus given a M designation, and overall it was seen as having tested quite well. The problem is, by the time it finished its testing period, it had been decided that the American military wanted to move away from having a smaller number of armored personnel carriers with a large number of dismounts, more back towards that World War II style of where you have a lot of carriers with about a squad in each. So, unfortunately, these never actually got the chance, although they do look pretty cool. Although they are, kind of ridiculously large. Following that new design brief led to the M75, derived from a design derived from the M24. So basically, during this period, the US military was just bouncing between whether you base it off of an M18 or an M24, which is kind of a neat game of, ping pong. Ultimately, it would carry 10 dismounts in line with the new design brief, and about 1,700 of these would be made, where they would see pretty decent service in the Korean War. However, some of the criticisms of the vehicle was it was too heavy, it still weighed 19 tons, and it was too tall. It was 108 inches or 2.75 meters tall. More on the industrial side, it was also a very expensive vehicle. This being one of the disadvantages of a track system is that it is not only more expensive to manufacture, it is more time-consuming and more expensive to maintain compared to a fully wheeled option. In 1953, these things cost about $72,000 to make. For context, the M3 half-track this was replacing only cost about $10,000 when it was produced during World War II. So yeah, it was a decade earlier, and inflation's a thing, but inflation's not that much of a thing to make up for a 7 times cost difference. This would lead to the need for a cheaper version. That cheaper version would be the M59. One of the ways that they made this cheaper was they swapped out a military engine for strapping 2 civilian engines together. This was less expensive, but it also resulted in the vehicle being slower. Even with it being slower, they had to reduce the armor to about half as thick as the previous vehicle had been, just to get it up to acceptable speeds. Still carried 10 dismounts and introduced the theoretical capability to be amphibious. The reason I say theoretical capability is these vehicles, any military vehicle like this that is said to have amphibious capabilities, has to be usually converted over. The seals have to be checked, or in some cases added. It has to be well maintained. It can't have any damage. And it's a situation where you have to do that, and that's a time-consuming process, because if you miss something and you're halfway across a deep river and discover you don't have a seal in place, that's likely the loss of the vehicle and very possibly the loss of several, if not all, personnel inside. So vehicles like this should more be thought of as deep wading vehicles as opposed to properly amphibious vehicles. This is true both for Western and Soviet designs of the time. I am not discriminating based on your political alliance structure of origin, amphibious should always be a bit in air quotes, especially for earlier vehicles. Being cheaper, I couldn't really find any consistent sources, or really any sources, on how much cheaper, but they did make 6,500 of these things over a 7-year time period, so it clearly met the design brief sufficiently. It would see limited service in the Vietnam War before being superseded by its successor, and as that was happening, it would be transferred and sold to other countries, although in a somewhat limited fashion. Respectable, but nowhere near what we'll see shortly. As an interesting aside, although the M75 was complained about for being too heavy and too tall, the M59 wasn't any shorter or lighter than its predecessor. A lot of sources will describe it as having a lower profile, but then list it actually as being marginally taller. So I'm not sure why that's the case, but just for completeness sake, mentioning it. However, it would be replaced by the M113. Between 1960 and 2007, that's right, this thing was produced until 2007, over 80,000 would be produced. Its protection was rated against small arms fire from all directions, and later upgrade packages would see things like the frontal armor increase to be able to survive things like 50 cal rounds, at least from long range. Its armor was now made out of aluminum as opposed to steel. This was to reduce weight because the United States wanted these things to be air mobile. In this case, that means it can be loaded into the back of an aircraft and flown to another airbase to be unloaded for a strategic mobility capability, as opposed to what you'll see with some Soviet designs, specifically things like their BMDs, which are designed to be able to be air-dropped. Basically, you put the vehicle on a pallet and strap a parachute to the pallet and the vehicle. That is a very different interpretation of an air-mobile infantry carrier. Although there are a couple what can only be described as, hopefully, drug-induced schizophrenic episodes about making this thing fly. But that's enough about that particular realm of the internet that, yeah, is best left just leave it alone. It's not worth it. As far as its carrying capacity, 11 to 15 dismounts, depending on what version. And of course, that's assuming you haven't converted it into something that removes its troop carrying capacity, because in the best traditions of armored personnel carriers, this thing has an utterly absurd number of variants, and maybe in the future I'll do a little review of some of them, because it's extensive and does get weird. That aluminum armor, though, was effective in bringing its weight down. It now weighs about 12.5 tons. Again, that's going to vary a lot by what you've strapped onto it. And it is still widely in service with about 50 countries. And there were estimates that while this in US service was being pushed further and further into deep reserve, that it actually probably wasn't going to entirely leave US service until the end of the 2030s. Which would mean its total service life within the United States military, theoretically, could have been 70 years. With disruptive events occurring, we don't know whether that's going to be made shorter or longer, as military expenditure around the world has slightly increased for reasons of current events, and I'll sort of leave it there. So, I hope that has given everyone a little bit more of an understanding on how the United States arrived at one of its most iconic pieces of military equipment. The United States certainly wasn't the only military to make extensive use of a metal box, but it is probably the one most associated with the blocky form. I hope you've all enjoyed this actually relatively brief, which is somewhat unique for me, look into a piece of military equipment and its history. And I hope to see you all again next time. Bye-bye.